I should say the most important piece of equipment in the grading suite I've found are these slate coasters. I love them. They don't end up sticking to whatever you're putting on them and going clunk when they fall off. I've had these ever since I had a suite in New York. Little colorist tip there. I guess now is the time. It is 4 o'clock. Thanks to everyone for joining me. I'm anticipating probably getting a few more people joining me, so I'll dither for a minute. I'm assuming you all know who I am. My name is Alexis Van Hurkman. I wrote the color correction handbook. I'm a working colorist, although I don't do as much color work now as I used to, because I also work as a director. And most of my projects are very small, and most of them have not been distributed before you ask. Although if you go to my website, there's information about what movies you can see. I had a whopping 88 people sign up, but I have no idea whom of those is actually going to turn up. So I will proceed with my introduction. It's March 27th. Thank you so much for joining me on this happy hour with Alexis Van Hurkman. This is a gin and tonic, in case you were wondering. It is a somewhat light pour because I didn't want to be falling down on camera. That would probably be bad. So first off, I just want to give a big thank you to Blackmagic Design for sponsoring this series. And I want all of us to thank them for employing the DaVinci Resolve team to make some really incredible software. I'm lucky enough to work with them as a consultant. It's a great group of people. And I also want to give a shout out to the hardware teams at Blackmagic who make such great interfaces and control surfaces and who keep them all affordable. So, you know, good on them. And thank you for sponsoring this webinar. I also want to give a shout out to Flanders Scientific. I had a conversation with American President Bram Desmet, and he mentioned to me, and I'm passing it on to you, that if you're a small-time operator and you're having to work at home all of a sudden, and you need a monitor in order to successfully home isolate while you're working, give them a call. If you're poor and you need a bit of a break, they will work with you. So I just wanted to pass that along. They're not sponsoring this. I just wanted you to know because their monitors are great and they're cool people. Also, I wanted to mention that Flanders Scientific is still running a fundraiser for Sean and Stephanie Mullen. Here we go. They do all of the rampant design videos that you can buy. And Sean has developed cancer, and he's developed cancer at the worst possible time. So what Flanders Scientific is doing is, if I go ahead, if you look at me on the video, they're selling these monitor cleaning kits. It's kind of hilarious because they have a whole warehouse full of them. And if you want to hoard something, hoard these, because half of the cost of buying these goes to Sean and Steph and their fundraiser. So they're monitor wipes, but they're nice and soft. You can use them for all kinds of things. If you're out of toilet paper, there you go. Here's something you can hoard with a song in your heart. So I also wanted you to see their fundraiser page, because if you want to just contact them directly, we've all benefited from their work at Rampant Design. We've all benefited as viewers and also as artists from the work they do and the stock footage they make available. So if you can help them out, that would be awesome. And then lastly, I want to give a big shout out to my producer, Sunjung Wang and Gaia Mount, for letting me use footage from the movie we made together, Carry My Heart to the Yellow River. If you want more information about that, go to my webpage, vanhurkman.com. I don't really want to go into that right now. And there we have it. So I'm up to 36 attendees, and I'm going to start answering questions. I want everyone to know that I've got the Q&A window open. I'm focusing what I'm doing on the questions that were submitted to me in advance first. If I can get through all of those, then I'll be fielding additional questions. I'd be surprised if I got through all of them, so we'll see. I'm trying to preserve the Q&A interface for questions that people have about the answer that I'm giving about a particular topic. So that's that. I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. So first off, I'm going to answer Peter Barber's question. I don't know if he's shown up at all. If you have, go ahead and wave your hand, Peter, who asked me how many gin and tonics are too many. You know, that answer is really up to your capacity. I generally have one. More than that, and I get happy. More than that, and I get silly. So I'm just keeping it to one right now. So on to a more serious question. Joseph Owens has a question about identifying faces for magic makeup. So Joe, you're out there. I'm going to go ahead and turn you on. Hey, Joe.
And we're with you.
All right. And now I'm going to go ahead and share my UI. And I'm going to jump to some clips that I've got set up. So first things first, when you ask this questions, what exactly were you curious about? Were you curious about how to select one of multiple faces in the frame?
Well, that's a big one, because very often what I work with are basically talking headshots, so I don't have a lot of choice in who, but how does it decide?
So let me show you. I'm going to go ahead and add a node here, and I'm going to go down to, I know it's going to blow.
You could just type FACE in the search.
I know. I just like finding the category. So it's in the refine category. And I just like to point out every time I talk about the face refinement tool that the reason we called it the face refinement tool, and I say we in terms of my work with the team when this tool was in development, it's not just about making people pretty. It can also be about making them craggy. It's about controlling the characteristics of a face. It's not about just making people prettier. So I'm going to drag this on top of a node, and when I click analyze, what it's supposed to do is throw up a variety of boxes and let me choose which face I'm wanting to track.
But the figure on the right-hand side of the screen presents a little bit higher contrast eyes, nose, and mouth. So maybe that's why it just made an assumption.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. And just so you know, and everyone else out there knows, I'm kind of doing an experiment in that I've set up clips for myself to use to answer these questions. But this is the first time I've used this tool in a little bit, because I figured there's no better way of putting myself on the hot seat than experiencing things the way you guys are experiencing them. So this is interesting to me. This is not working the way I wrote it in the manual. You can see this little box here. That's the box that's supposed to appear over every trackable face. Now, it could be that for whatever reason, these other faces are considered not trackable because they're too in profile. So let's try another clip. That's why I had a few clips here. If I drop this on, there we go. So this is the UI that you're supposed to see. If it can detect multiple faces that are considered to be trackable, you can click on the face that you want to track. So if I'm wanting to work on the mother, then I can go ahead and click Analyze, and now it's tracking her face. So this is one of those unfortunate byproducts of a tool being so auto magical, is sometimes you don't have a choice, because it really depends on what the code decides that it can do.
So
if that makes sense.
Is this new in 16? The two boxes?
No. That was always part of the UI. It's just that depending on the footage you have, they may or may not appear, and there's no feedback, right? So yeah, that's.
Now, does it always look at the whole screen? There's no way of forcing it to just look at somebody instead of doing some options like using a power window?
That's a good question. It may be that it. Well, you know what? I'll bet there's a way of hacking it, but it's probably weird, and it's probably more work than you want to do, and then return it back to normal.
Yeah, and it's not really the product as advertised.
Yeah. So it's just a function of that's how the scanning works. And it's always been like that. I mean, I don't want to say from the very first version, because I don't think the very first version that shipped with whatever .0 had this. But certainly in the next dot release, this was added, I believe. And it's always been there. It's just a matter of whether or not it triggers.
Right. Yeah, occasionally I do see that the overlay may or may not appear, and that may just be a glitch in my hardware setup.
Yeah, that can be a little inconsistent, I found, and that I think has gotten better in subsequent versions. This UI has been rearranged a few times to try and tame the number of controls that appear within it, but you can control whether or not the overlay is turned on, and whether or not you can see the mask that's being automatically generated for all of this.
How often do you tweak the mask?
I tweak the mask almost every time I use this tool.
What do you find yourself doing?
Generally speaking, what I find myself doing is going in and working with the size of the mask. Sometimes I need to get a little more chin or a little less chin. Sometimes easing in with mask softness can give you a little bit of pseudo shadow fall off, given what you're doing. And then the mask refinement slider is, basically kind of a smoothing operation for the mask that's found. And sometimes you want to make it more or less crispy, depending on what you're doing.
Right. Now, this particular mask, with all the other controls that are associated with its various parts, eyes, nose, lips, forehead, chin, cheeks, that kind of stuff. I was also wondering whether there was any way of pulling any of those things out and doing Boolean operations with them, or using a node, a key node mixer to power window it, or do any other kind of geometrics with it, the hands passing in front of the face, that kind of stuff.
Yes. There is a way of extracting this mask. Unfortunately, there's no way of extracting these subset masks. And the way you extract this mask is a bit of a hack. You simply leave this show mask checkbox turned on.
Export it as a clip,
and then you can connect this as a key.
Oh.
Which is admittedly a hack, but what you can do is you can copy and paste that node into another instance if you want to, have freedom to nudge your actual face adjustment, but then you also want to export the mask or connect the mask as a key. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, let's say I want to, I'll just do something silly to make the point. So I'm gonna bypass that and then connect this to that. And now I hope you can all see that I'm using, I gotta move windows around a little bit. If I turn this on, you can see that as I'm soloing these nodes, this is now permanently set up to just deliver a matte. And I can connect an RGB output to a key input. That was an update from a couple releases ago, I think. And so setting this up and piping it to that, when I make an adjustment with this node, you can see that that adjustment is now being limited by this. So that's a way that you can hack your way around using the mask. But unfortunately, it's not specific to each of those pieces of the mask. But that's an awfully good feature request.
It might be, depending on how involved visual, like post-makeup artists, you could throw this mask out for them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, send DaVinci an email. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. So
yeah, I inadvertently exported the mask itself as a clip last week.
Oh, yes. That's why this is a little bit of a hack. You kind of have to beware of those mask preview buttons.
Yeah, turn that off before you export the clip.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and put a pin in that one and move to the next question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Okay, so next question is from Richard Woodburn. Is Richard Woodburn out there? Richard, I'm not seeing him, but I'll answer the question because maybe he'll watch the video later. And his question is, do I really need a Decklink card, or can I just go straight out of my computer to a monitor? I'm going to get this off because that is not the most attractive grade. And I'm going to go back to me because this is just a verbal question that I can answer. The truth is that I don't necessarily recommend it at this point in time, depending on what you're doing. If you're an editor and you just want to see what you're editing on a big screen, on say a second monitor, that functionality has actually been enabled. And actually, maybe I can show you something on the interface. If you go up to Workspace, there is a video clean feed. And this video clean feed, bit of an odd name, but it is accurate, lets you choose a display that you want to output the current image to. And it'll dutifully output whatever is showing on your viewer to that second computer display. Now, one thing I've heard people are getting hung up on is they think that they need to turn dual screen on to do this. That's not how it works. Leave dual screen off and just go to video clean feed and choose a display and it'll happen. However, being a colorist, here's why I'm being nuanced about this answer. If you're an editor and you don't need a color critical look at your image, this is great. And it doesn't really matter how good or how terrible your display is. Chances are most computer displays these days look pretty good. But if you're a colorist and you need a high quality, accurate and calibrated look at what you're doing, most computer displays aren't really suitable for that kind of thing. Now, there are displays like those in ISO's range. There are displays like the new Apple display, all of which claim to be great for calibrated work. I have not evaluated any of these, so I don't have an opinion. I'm just going to say that when I work, I tend to use a broadcast display with video out. So you can do it. Whether or not it's advisable to do it depends on what you're doing. So that's that question. So Bill Holley. Is Bill Holley out there? Bill Holley? Oh, there you are. So you had a question. I've just unmuted you, Bill. So hello.
Hello. Hi.
This is almost like a talk show. It's kind of weird. So you asked me about best practices for grading older film.
Yeah, so the majority of my work is with archive film, and we just started using Resolve. We were running with the Spirit 2K and the 2K Plus DaVinci, and we've switched over to still using the Spirit 4K with Scanity as well, but using the Resolve.
Okay.
And so I'm familiar with Resolve, but not well versed in the different techniques for maybe using it to deal with film-derived digital product.
So I'll start off by saying that I'm not necessarily the best person to be asking about this because my entire career has been built on filmmakers and documentarians doing primarily digital work. I have graded one or two projects originated with film. By and large, my kind of stock answer is I didn't find those experiences particularly different from grading any other kind of log encoded digital cinema file format. So in that sense, I think what I would say is if you're doing log scans to OpenEXR or whatever other format you guys are deciding to use.
2K, 4K DPX.
2K, 4K DPX, okay. So if you're looking at the display right now, you see this color space transform plugin I have attached to Node 1. This is your friend, in my view. If you're working with log formats and you just want a fast way of converting it from log to whatever color space you want to work in. The color science is great. I use this on just about every program I work on now. It has tone mapping options, gamut mapping options, and it's manually set up so that if you don't want to, I mean, you can get the same kind of thing using Resolve color management. If you go into your project settings and you go into color management and you choose DaVinci YRGB color managed, you have similar settings here, which you can break up into separate color space and gamma settings if you want. And this does the same thing in a somewhat automated fashion, but I find a lot of people still prefer to leave that turned off and use the color space transform node to do the same kind of color management just within their grade, as opposed to using a LUT. I have nothing against LUTs, but one of the things that LUTs do is they will clip out of bounds image data going above or below your maximum and minimum levels as handled by that LUT. This doesn't have that limitation. And also LUTs, depending on how many points there are interpolating all of the transforms in between points of the LUT. This color space transform is actually kind of a smooth mathematical curve operation. And it's just easy to set up and completely customizable. So I guess that would be one of my tips, is explore the color space transform operation and explore Resolve color management if you're looking for a way to give yourself an automated conversion. And then, of course, because Resolve is node-based, you can go ahead and add nodes before that operation and after that operation. So if you want to grade using the log controls, and that's the way you like to work, you can do that down here in this pre-transform node. And then you can go post-transform and you're working in Rec 709 or whatever color space you're going to. So, you know, other than that, all the grading tools, you know, work the way you've experienced them in your long career. So if you have any other specific questions, I'm happy to field them right now. Or did that answer your question?
Well, that's certainly something that I'm going to experiment with. Thank you for that.
Sure.
The other thing I've been playing with is the noise reduction and edge sharpening and stuff like that for stuff that's heavily grained. Is there any tidbits of or tips that you might have,
you know,
towards?
I've got another person who's asked a question about noise reduction. So I'll go ahead and defer that to their question. But feel free to hit me with a text if you have something you want to add. Yeah. So
Great,
there you go. Oh, but let me just ask you one question though. I'm curious. What are your deliverables these days? I understand that you're sitting on a library of archival footage. What are you mastering to? Are you mastering to 709? Are you starting to master to HDR? What are you delivering?
At this point, my deliverables are very limited. So I'm doing 709. So actually, I create ProRes 4444. And then the duplication area at the NFB creates all different formats for the deliverables for the web, for viewing copies. And then there's people that have to go through stock shots, for instance, and sort them after I've transferred them.
Okay. So you're basically creating a mezzanine file that someone else has the job of turning into a variety of different deliverables.
Exactly, yeah.
That is such a deluxe workflow. I've been making all my own deliverables for this film I have on the film festival circuit because God knows I'm affordable to myself. But yeah, they stack up, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting when switching from originally we were just doing flat copies, 2K, 4K DPX files, and on top of that we were doing HDSR tapes.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to get away from the HDSR tapes, or I wanted to get away. It started about 1.5 years ago trying to get them to move. We had the Resolve panels, but they were sitting in the basement not doing anything. I was like, guys, come on, let's use this. Let's get it up and running. $30,000 panels sitting in the basement. So we finally got that going, and then R&D got involved, and they wanted me to make burn-in copies for this guy, and multiple format outputs, and I've got like 13,000 titles that I have to go through, guys. I can't make all of this stuff and do client stock shots and stuff like that. So I was able to talk them into just make the DPX, and you guys, there's already a workflow in place. You guys use that workflow to deal with my output.
So by the way, on that note, there's one thing I think a lot of people will be interested in who may or may not know. This was a feature that was added. Oh my God, you know what? So I write the DaVinci Resolve manual, but once a feature is done, I can't remember which new features came out with which versions. It's all like history to me. So it came out at some version, and that is the ability to go into timelines, to go into timeline settings, and to actually use custom settings for individual timelines that have their own format, their own timeline resolution, their own way to handle mismatched resolution files, their own monitoring settings, and their own output settings for people creating multiple deliverables. It used to be that DaVinci Resolve only had one setting for every timeline in the whole project. Now you have the ability and the freedom to duplicate timelines and then to switch between either using the basic settings, which are the project-wide settings, or using custom settings and setting that timeline up to be very specifically different. So that's something people should know about. But the other thing is, when I show people this, I also want them to know that depending on the kind of deliverables you're creating, it's often the case that you don't necessarily need to create multiple timelines if all of the timelines, if all your deliverables are the same frame rate, or they're specific derivations of frame rates. You can actually go into the deliver page, as I just have, and in the video settings, you can choose different resolutions, and you can set up multiple jobs at multiple resolutions. And you can do things like do a 2997 output with 3.2 pull down insertion added to it without having to create an additional timeline. You just basically create a separate render job, add it to the job queue, and you're done. You can go ahead and render out multiple deliverables from the one timeline. So don't feel like you have to make multiple timelines if these settings will suffice for you. If they don't, then you have the option to create multiple timelines to create whatever exotic combination of timelines at different sizes with different sizings applied if you're having to pan and scan, and you can set things up that way. So something to let your colleagues know about.
Very good.
All right, so I'm going to jump back to the color page. I'm going to go ahead and mute you. Thanks a lot. And I'm moving to Brandon Jones. Is Brandon Jones with us? He is not, but I can answer his question very quickly, and I suspect it'll be of interest to everyone. So he can watch it recorded later on. And his question is, what is the workflow for mixed delivery for both HDR and SDR? Can I avoid grading my project twice? So when I started grading HDR, and my last 3 projects as a director and as a colorist, because I typically grade all my own projects, have been specifically for HDR. I asked myself this very same question because I'm lazy. I don't want to have to do more grading than I have to. So I found a way, and I've talked to other colorists since, and most people are doing it in a similar way. So I'm just going to go ahead and show off my pseudo dual source, or I'm sorry, my pseudo single source workflow for doing this. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and save this project, and I'm going to go to a demo that I gave at NAB last year, because I set up all of my grades to be able to be quickly loaded and seen. So this is the timeline for my movie, Carry My Heart to the Yellow River. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. Yes. All right, here we go. So you can see this is a pretty complicated timeline, partially because this was my mastering timeline, and I tend to stack up things for different deliverables. And partially because I have this one track V4, which is specifically for this demo. But I wanted to show you all my grades, basically how I graded this. So the way I have been working is I've been grading my HDR version first. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that everybody do that. What I recommend these days is that whichever deliverable is going to be seen by the most people in the next year, that's probably the version you should do first. Because I've generally found for myself, and I've heard from other colorists who've sort of said something similar, one tends to put most of one's creative effort into the first version of a grade. That's when you're seeing the images fresh. You have all these great ideas. The client's sitting there. You work all this stuff out. It's amazing. And then the second trim pass that you do, there's maybe a little less enthusiasm. You still care passionately about it, but you've already seen the material and you've already sort of had those eureka moments, and they maybe don't come so quickly or easily the second time. So if most people on Earth are going to see the SDR version, maybe work on that first and then trim up to HDR. If you're really passionate about the HDR version and you think most people are going to be seeing that first, say you're delivering to Netflix, then do what I do and grade the HDR version first and then trim down to SDR. That's how I do it. So here's how I do it to try and minimize the amount of work that I do. What you're looking at here is my HDR grade. And for most shots, this is it. It's 4 nodes. I've got a base grade knocking into shape. I've got a grade where I'm specifically adjusting the HDR pop, what's happening at the very top of the image. Now, this is all wrong because we're actually looking at my down conversion of the HDR grade. So ignore the scopes. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and look at keyframes instead. The HDR pop node is where I basically fine tune my HDR levels. HSL curves. Anyone who's read anything I've written knows I'm a huge fan of the HSL curves or the hue curves for fine tuning the image. And then a stylization node where I put whatever unique little zhuzh I'm doing in any given scene. And as I click through, you'll see sometimes I add additional nodes to take care of specific problems as it comes up. Kind of depends on what the scene needs. Sometimes I don't need so many nodes, but it's a simple grade. My HDR grades are a simple grade. Bo Hakala, who was the DP for this piece, was a brilliant DP. He does great naturalistic work, which is just what I like. So I had no need for the HDR pass to do insane cartwheels, getting the image that I want. The image that I wanted was largely in camera. I just had to kind of refine it into how I like HDR to be expressed. So once I had all that done, what I did with this particular project is I basically went into the timeline grade, and I'm going to hide the gallery so I've got more room to show this grade. And you can see once I go down to SDR, now I'm needing to turn cartwheels to get what I want out of the SDR image. And it makes me laugh endlessly that I have to put so much more work into my SDR down conversions than I do my original HDR grade. And maybe that's one of the reasons I like HDR so much, is it's just less work because you've got wider range to play with. You don't have to crush things so heartbreakingly. Now, the other thing is I'm being excessively organized here. I'm not usually this crazed about preserving individual adjustments. But again, on a scene-by-scene basis, I know that each one of these things is something I'm going to want to potentially customize. And I wanted to be able to go back after a couple months when I needed to create a new deliverable and see exactly what the grade is doing and how it's working and how it's built. So that's kind of why I'm being so anally retentive, one could say. So what I do is I create kind of the best grade for the whole movie, and I scrub around while I do it, and I fool around, and I basically get everything to a decent starting point. And then what I did, and you can see down here, I've got all of these keyframes in the keyframe editor. Just to remind you, in case you have forgotten or you don't know, when I'm in clip mode, the keyframe editor is showing me keyframes of the currently selected node. But when I'm in timeline mode, there's only one grade that's being applied to the entire timeline. So this is a way you can apply a grade to fine tune the whole timeline, or if it's a 30-second spot and you use the clip grades to match all the clips together, you can use the timeline grade to add some style to the whole spot all at once. There are all kinds of things you can do with the timeline grade. I'm using the timeline grade as a down conversion. However, every scene is going to need to be tweaked. That's been my experience. And so what I did was I took advantage of a command. If you right-click the master track in the keyframe editor, there's this add EDL marks on tracks. And what that does is that adds a static keyframe to every cut in your edit. And then what I did is I worked through the scenes, and when I hit a new scene, I deleted all the unnecessary static keyframes within that scene, so that a single adjustment of this grade would go ahead and affect the whole scene, every single shot in that scene all at once. And then the static keyframe basically denotes a new adjustment. And that's how I did it. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It largely was. I'm very happy with this down conversion that I did. However, I don't use this feature anymore. The last project I did, I used grouping instead, and I added all this to basically the post clip grade. And that way, you know, it was about the same amount of effort creating all the groups for each scene versus doing this and deleting the keyframes I didn't need. That way ended up being a little more graceful. And yeah, so funnily enough, this down conversion that I did is what every single person at the 40 film festivals we've gotten into has seen. Only a few people have seen the HDR version, which kind of breaks my heart, and I hope to change that at some point. But this is what I do. I start with the HDR grade, and then I switch to the timeline mode, and I do a down conversion, and then I trim that down conversion for each scene to get the most I can out of it. So that's what I do. There are other ways of doing this with mezzanine files, you know, but the concept in most cases is generally similar. So that's that. So now I'm going to move on to a name I know I'm going to mispronounce, so my apologies in advance. But Fatih Oger. Ah, there you are. So I've just unmuted you, Fatih. If you can unmute yourself. Hello.
Hi there.
Hey, did I get your name anywhere close to right?
Yeah, it's Fatih, but you are right.
Fatih.
Yeah.
Good to meet you. Thanks for joining me. So your question was noise reduction pipeline. Would I use it on a timeline node or pre-group nodes? How do I approach noise?
Yes, because when I use noise reduction, you know, it's like high process application, so everything gets so slow.
Yes.
So I have to add for every clip and then turn it off before you export, turn it on, and it's like getting messy.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. Even on my now 4-year-old super micro with 2 aging Titans in it, noise reduction can slow things down. And every year, noise reduction generally sees some kind of improvement in DaVinci Resolve. And that improvement generally gives you an option for higher quality, which makes it run even slower. So, so we do what we can. So I've got a clip. It's a night shot, and it's got some noise in it. Not a whole ton. I actually looked at all the clips I have permission to show, and I haven't gotten any horrific noise on any of the projects I've worked on to show. But this has some. If I zoom in, you can see that, yeah, I got some vibration there. So what I tend to do, and so the first part of your question is, do I add noise reduction to the whole timeline? And my answer to that is no, I don't. Generally speaking, I try to add noise reduction in the least destructive way that I can. I try to add as little as I can get away with to get an acceptable result. Usually I'm not looking to eliminate the noise. I'm just looking to subdue it in shots where it's a little distracting. I think images that lack noise altogether, especially when you can see that they're dark, it's not necessarily my aesthetic, but I'm not going to argue with other people who want to do that. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. This being a narrative piece, I liked it to have a little bit of life. So I didn't want to eliminate the noise. I just wanted to subdue it. So what I tend to do to save myself heartache, because I know I'm going to want to adjust the amount of noise reduction on a per clip basis, is I generally add a node. I either do this in the first node, or if I've already made a grade and I decide, there's too much noise now, I'll add a node before the first node. So the new first node of my grade is going to be where I put the noise reduction. So then I go into, there it is. I go into my noise reduction and I do whatever it is I'm going to do. If I'm going to use both temporal and spatial noise reduction, I'll go ahead and set this to better. And then generally speaking, I try to get away, like I said, with adding the least amount I can get away with. In this case, a little bit actually goes a pretty long way. And then if I'm getting into spatial noise reduction, the enhanced mode is really good. And I'll just stick with small. I mean, it's so good at preserving detail. If I turn this off and on, you can see it's subtle. It's doing a great job of preserving all that minute detail. And now it's killing my performance, right?
Yeah.
It's doing a fantastic job. But here's my deal is I go ahead and turn node caching on for that particular node. And then I make sure that I've got on playback the render cache set to smart or user. And now what's going to happen is that noise reduction will be cached upstream of all my other adjustments. And by doing it this way, that means I can have as many nodes with as many adjustments happening downstream of this, and I'm not going to have to constantly recache that first node. This is the way I work. And it served me well because yes, you have to cache that and it's going to take you a little bit of time, but once it's cached, you're done and you're back to grading real time. Now, if I put
Yeah.
this node at the end, you will get a slightly different result. And it's been a long time since I wrote that bit in the manual, and since I've done that myself. I believe if you put it downstream, your result ends up looking a little bit sharper, which could be better or worse, depending on what you're trying to do. But in my view, having to constantly recache every time you adjust the grade just wasn't worth that small difference. So this is the way I do it. Other people may do it differently, but this is what I do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, seems fair and practical. Actually, I want to add another question there. Do you like clear your caches after every project done?
You mean when the project is completely done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. There's no reason having a folder full of stuff
Mm-hmm.
taking up room if you don't need it. That said, do I remember to do that with regularity? Probably not. But I'm not grading programs every single week, so that's not a huge concern of mine. But being mindful of that, and for those who don't know, you can go into the playback menu and choose how to delete the render cache. Now, it's rare, but there are occasions where I have found the render cache for a particular clip doesn't clear when I make another adjustment. And I'm like, what happened? I made an adjustment and I'm not seeing it. So that's where it can be handy to choose the clips that are affected and go in and blow away the cache for selected clips. If you're seeing you're having that problem, it's an easy thing to fix. The cache mechanism in Resolve can be as automatic or as hands-on as you want it to be. I go back and forth. Sometimes I stick to user cache, so I have to specifically turn it on when there's a clip that I want to cache. And other times I'll leave it set to automatic and it works fine. I guess it just depends on my mood. That's not a very good answer, but there you have it. So is
Thank
that,
you.
oh, and to answer the last part of your question, how do I approach noise on shadows, midtones, and highlights? Generally speaking, I don't. And maybe that's a failing of me as a colorist, or maybe that's just me being smart with my time. I'm not sure which, but I tend to apply noise reduction to the overall clip. And again, I'm not, in most instances, cranking it. So since I add the barest amount of noise reduction I can get away with, I don't feel like I need to be particularly targeted. Like I'm getting it where it's bothering me. And I've never had an instance where I felt, I want there to be more noise in the highlights than there is in the shadows. That just hasn't come up for me. But you can do it. Certainly you can limit the noise reduction with Windows or with any of the qualifiers, any of the keys you can pull. Generally speaking, if you're pulling a key to limit noise reduction, I would recommend sticking with a Luma key or a really, high quality color key if you've got good media, because if you have a noisy key, then you're going to be applying noise reduction in kind of a noisy way, if that makes sense. And that's not going to help you. You'd be, in those instances, better off using a window to try and attack the specific thing you're trying to noise reduce. So is that good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and mute you. Okay, so Mark Osborne, are you out there? You are not out there. He had a question about how to stop the mini panel from activating things in the UI on its own. I wanted to get a little more information from him about what he was seeing there. Personally, I like it when the UI updates as I switch modes on the control panel. But I'm kind of a weirdo. I use the control surface and my trackball kind of hand in hand. I'm not necessarily a control surface purist where I only keep my hands on the control surface. So that's not the kind of thing that usually bothers me. But maybe next week I'll get some insight from Mark about what he's seeing. Moving on, Jim Jordan, are you out there? Yes, you are. Hi, Jim. I've just turned on your ability to talk.
Hello.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, good evening.
Thanks for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
So your question was, please give solutions for color correcting mixed light scenes. Did you have any particular issue that was bugging you, or is this just a general thing?
I would say I kind of have a client that we shoot a lot of people in. It's a glass building, glass walls all the way around, although it's huge. So you'd really only be around one wall of glass. And then inside that, there's a lot of fluorescence and other things. And obviously I can flag light off the person that's in the scene, and I do, but still some of that muddy light gets on all kinds of things in the background and in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
I played around with grabbing secondaries and using the view over saturation and reducing saturation on some colors I don't care for.
Mm-hmm.
And it works nice for me. I don't know, just go ahead and...
Well, you just knocked off two of my answers, so good job, you.
All right.
But let me, no, you're on the right track. You're absolutely on the right track. And I put together a timeline with some mixed light scenes. Now, I'm like, why is it so weird? Because I need the zoom to fit. Now, most of these mixed light situations were supposed to be that way. So I'm kind of abusing the clips and pretending that, like, okay, well, we shot it that way, and then the client decided they didn't like the way they shot it, and so they want me to regrade it. I personally am a big fan of mixed lighting if it's done artistically and well, but I totally hear what you're saying. It's not always what you want it to be. And sometimes there can be a little bit of buyer's regret. So generally speaking, the way I tend to handle these things depends on what kind of spill I'm looking at. So I'm going to just quickly add some nodes to work with. And I tried to pick different situations. So like in this one, that green is a very keyable thing. So because I have a background in VFX work, I tend to use keying more than other colorists I've talked to, just because it's great. I don't have to keyframe it. I don't have to roto it. I just go to my qualifier. And in this case, I want to do something very general. So I'm going to stick with HSL. I'm going to go ahead and just see if I can grab that green. And whenever I use the HSL qualifier in Resolve, the first thing I do is increase the width. Because people who don't like the HSL qualifier tend to, I've found, not like it because they do a sample and they get this. And they're like, what's that? That's terrible. It's the worst key ever. It's because, for whatever reason, the HSL qualifier is being as specific as it can, which is actually a benefit in some instances. So if I just widen that up, I can get a big fat chunk of that hue. And then I can go ahead and play around with those other dimensions of color. to see if I can fill in those gaps. Now, this is a down conversion of the original material. So if I was working with the original raw clip, I'd have a better chance. I have also found that I love the clean black and clean white controls. They just work so well. And so now I've got this going on, and I'd spend more time finessing this, but for now I'm just going to say that that's good enough. And now I can go in there and use whatever controls I want to use to deal with this. So I might go ahead and just make a, oh, I'm in log. How many times do I do that? You know, so I can start pushing things around a little bit to try and deal with that. If that's going to give me joy, that's one way I could do it. Maybe offset would work better to just do an overall. No, maybe. Depending on what I need to do. Sometimes I'll just go ahead and desaturate it. So, you know, that's one approach, is pulling a key on the offending spill and dealing with it that way. Now, another thing I'll do is, let me close this up. I'll jump into curves and I'll use the hue versus hue curve. So in this case, I'll go ahead and sample. And with the hue versus hue curve, you can kind of push those hues around. Now, again, people sometimes complain about these HSL curves because when you click to sample, you initially get this very restrictive slice, which causes some hard contouring. So usually what I do is I hold the shift key down and click once on either side. When you hold the shift key down, clicking on the curve adds a point without inadvertently moving the curve. So that's a nice tip. And then I right click to delete those points. And now I have a much broader adjustment. And I can kind of push that out. Maybe I want to bring those out a little bit more. So I can maybe do that. And then I can maybe go into my saturation and play around with that. So that's another way that I'll sometimes try to deal with this issue. Sometimes a better way of dealing with the issue is to just go ahead and use a mask. If it's a easy geographical area to hit, I don't like how orange this light is up here in the corner, I can go ahead and summon a good old-fashioned oval. And I can go ahead and do whatever I need to do there. It might be messing around with the color temperature. It might simply be desaturating it so it's not bugging me. And in this sort of adjustment, for me, it's all about what works. Whatever blunts the problem people have with it, great. You know, if it's just a little bit of desaturating, yeah, it's a cheat and you're leaching a little bit of color out, but if it looks good, it looks good. You know, chances are I find it's a little bit of color wheel adjustment and a little bit of desaturation gets me where I want to go. Now, one other thing I want to point out is I've found mixed lighting situations in a variety of unexpected places. So this clip right here, it's from a documentary I graded. And you can see as the camera pans over and goes out the window, you can see that the window coating is making the image look significantly different from just the open window. And in this case, what I ended up doing is creating a custom mask and just rotoing it so that as the camera pans, this just kind of pushes over. And you can get away with some really hacky animating jobs in cases like this. And that was how I dealt with that instance of unexpectedly mixed lighting to either side of the thing. So yeah, those are kind of my greatest hit solutions. Something like this, I would probably start with a mask if I wanted to blunt that, you know, bluish evening lighting in favor of a different directorial direction, because the shot is static in the way it is. This is just the fastest, easiest solution for me to, you know, play around with warming her up, doing whatever it is I need to do. Obviously, I'd want to soften that edge however much I needed to. You know, other instances, you're going to have to, if you're worried about her, you're going to have to do a shape and track it to her. In other instances, sometimes it could be as simple as just, you know, pulling a key off that blue window. It, generally speaking, I'm trying to get to my thought process. So something hard and blue like this, I'll probably try a key. Something really static like that, assuming of course the camera's going to pan here, something static like this, I'll pull a window. You know, something like that, honestly, I'd probably start with a curve. And that's just based on things that worked quickly for me the last time I dealt with this. I will redeploy the same solution in the same kind of shot. So there's no best here. It's just whatever you can make work most effectively in the quickest amount of time so you can continue on with the rest of the program. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Okay.
Do you ever, if there's mixed light on a face of a character,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever played with the color compressor on a face? And
I have played with the color compressor in a variety of contexts, usually when I'm wanting to do something a little more stylized. I'll tell you what I wish I had the color compressor for, is this one documentary I graded where one of the interview subjects had a very just naturally modeled skin complexion. It was who she was, but I know that if they were able to afford a makeup artist that day, that they would have given her just a little bit of zhuzhing to be on camera. And I did that manually with curves, but the color compressor would have been great in that kind of situation. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you know what? Let's do it with this zombie. Why not? He definitely has a modeled complexion. So I'm going to reset that node. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, actually, I'm going to turn that back on just because it's fast. I'll fit that on there. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is open effects. And God, I'm trying to remember what category that is. It is in color compressor. All right, so I'm going to drop color compressor on that node. It's being limited by the window. For this, I want to go into the vector scope so that everyone can see what's going on. So right now, the vector scope on this node is just showing us the color on the face. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to just jam that up a little bit. But what I can do is I can choose a target color. Let's say this is the most attractive skin tone for this zombie, right? I now have a target color. And what I can do is I can raise the compress hue, compress saturation, compress luminance sliders to basically rotate all other hues towards that ideal hue, all other ranges of saturation towards that ideal range of saturation. And if I do it to luminance, then I just flatten everything out. So you can see what's happening is I'm basically able to push all the other colors in the image towards this ideal target color. Now, chances are this isn't going to be the last adjustment that I make. And chances are I'm going to use this in conjunction with some sort of a key, so I'm omitting the eyes and the hat and things like that. But the color compressor can be your best friend if you're doing a music video or you're doing some kind of crazy, commercial spot where you just want people looking like perfect porcelain. But if you're not doing that, if you're using it to solve problems with a more naturalistic program, I really do recommend exercising a light touch with this, because you can make people look real cosmetic commercial real fast, and I don't necessarily find that the most compelling thing to do. So yeah, that's definitely something you can do. Doing that with mixed light, I mean, it kind of depends on how the light's falling on the face. I'm guessing in the situations you're thinking of, you're probably dealing with light falling more on one of the planes of the face rather than the other. So you might want to, throw an oval around just the part of the face that's picking up the light. When you're doing grading of faces, those of you who are new to grading, it's a really good idea to bear in mind that the face is a three-dimensional shape, and each side of the face, left, right, front, back, side, is going to be picking up different lighting instruments on the set, depending on how the DP set things up. So it's usually a mistake if you're dealing with trying to fix mixed lighting falling onto a face to just grab the whole face like this, like I did. Really what you want to be doing is, if I go back to my window, you want to deal with the part of the face that's receiving that light, which is generally going to be, some plane. So there you go. Those are all the tips I can think of for that.
Sure. Very nice. I appreciate your information.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks a lot. Okay. So next question, Nahuel Cernek. I am completely screwing up your name, and I apologize for that. Nahuel, I've gone ahead and turned you on. Hello.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I have. Yes, I can.
Well, it's Nahuel. Yes, it's
Nahuel. Hello.
Yes, it's from Argentina.
So your question was, which way would be the best to sync sound and video, link them, and organize them to be edited in Resolve? So you're working on features?
Yes, I work as a DP and as a colorist for a few years, and now I'm back on directing feature films. So that's that. Always I color grade some projects, but they are edited by another editor. So now I'm trying to edit my own film, and I have no clue how to organize all the media with.
Okay.
And that's that. I try to color grade with DaVinci, and I want to edit it with DaVinci, but I have my audio and my video without syncing and without organizing.
Okay, so are you on your shoots? Are you using timecode sync with dual source audio, or are you using waveform syncing?
Waveform.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll just get this out of the way first. I'm a huge booster of editing in Resolve, and I'm a huge booster of doing all of your audio video sync in Resolve. I will say that while DaVinci Resolve's waveform syncing can be very robust, it's not always the best solution on earth. So just keep that in mind. You want to make sure that if you're using Resolve for waveform syncing, hopefully you have a clear recording associated with your video.
Okay.
So just FYI, I've used it enough to be pretty happy with it, but also to see where the limitations can be. That said, I'll give you a tip for making it work better and faster. So to do that, actually, I'm gonna save this. And I'm gonna go into this syncing audio project that I've created in advance. It doesn't have any media in it just yet. I'm gonna go into the media page and I'm gonna go into I'm using the offline media because I just happen to have that on this computer for
Okay.
my, what ended up being a 21-minute short. So it's kind of effectively a half-hour episode of TV. And the way that media was organized, we had our A unit, which was pretty much the unit. And then we had a drone unit. So all of the footage was organized that way. The A unit was organized by day. And then inside there, we have each day's audio and each day's video. Now, we shot on the Red Monstro, and like all Red cameras, the DIT basically gave me the cards, right? And I don't necessarily want all of this hierarchy in my project. What I do want, and what I'm getting at, is I had requested basically daily audio and video collections because I only ever wanted to sync one day's material at a time in an effort to avoid making Resolve have to work too hard by comparing, you know, each clip against all 16 days worth of media. I mean, that would just take a long time, and I don't want to, you know, I don't want to make Resolve work that hard when it's not necessary. So the way I tend to work is I sync each day one at a time. And the way I tend to organize my media for syncing is, you know, I'll go ahead and do day one. I will manually create a structure in this instance in order to use Resolve's importing mechanisms to best effect. So day one, and then inside of day one, I'll add a bin called day one audio. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up day one, and I'm going to drag the whole video folder into here. And when I do that, first it's going to say, hey, it's a different frame rate. Okay, change it. When I do that, Resolve automatically imports every single clip in every single subfolder into this one bin. It's really nice. Now I can do the same thing if I undo by right-clicking and choosing add folder and subfolders into media pool. Does the same thing. I just like drag and drop because it's fun. And then I'll select day one audio and I'll drag the audio bin there. Whatever bin is selected in this sidebar is the bin that media from media storage will be added to. And then I'll just do this for each day. Day two, audio, video audio, day 3, video audio, blah, blah, blah. So then when I need to go in and sync, I just right click and I go into auto sync audio, and you have all of these options. Now, I always request that A, we have timecode sync because I love timecode sync, and B, I also like having a waveform for reference just in case. So you can choose which you use, sync based on timecode, sync based on waveform. And then when you do this, choosing just based on timecode or based on waveform replaces the audio in the clip with the dual source recording. But if you choose appends tracks, then the dual source recording will be appended to the audio that was recorded on the camera. So you have all of them. Does that make sense?
Yes. So when I choose the clip and throw it in the timeline, it will go with the audio already synced.
Yeah. So the way it works is I'll show you just so you can see what the experience is. So these clips don't actually have an audio reference because we were shooting through a window. So there was just no way the camera was going to pick up useful audio in that instance. Oh, look, it's me. So there is no audio at all. As I scrub through, you can see in the audio meters, no audio. So if I right click and I do auto sync audio based on timecode, it will look like nothing has happened. Hey, don't embarrass me. Come on. Auto sync. Based on timecode. All right. Something's going wrong. And I don't know why. The demo gods are against me today. We finished the movie, so I tell you this worked fine before.
Okay.
Let me just for giggles, try doing it up there. Huh. That's weird. So what's going to happen is Sunday night, the engineers are going to get into the office in Singapore at DaVinci Resolve, and they're going to be like, Alexis, you didn't do this thing. I'm going to be like, yeah, I know. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay.
As far as I know, the rule has always been the audio needs to be within the folder that the video is in.
Okay.
So just for grins, if I put it all in the very same folder and I do that, oh, no, that's different. Huh. Oh, okay. So it is syncing. Just for some reason, my meters weren't showing it. All right. So
maybe it doesn't show them in
that's a mystery to me. So actually, you know what? This kind of brings up a good point, and everyone's being awfully patient with me. The point being, when you do the sync, there's no visible indication that anything has happened. That was the main point I wanted to make. So you do it, and you're like, oh, is that it? Did anything happen? And it doesn't look like anything happened, but it did in fact happen. Usually the way I test is to just open up a clip and scrub through it and see if I see levels in the meters. For some reason, the meters are not showing me levels. But if I go into the edit page and I just edit clips down here, you can see the two microphones and the mix, or actually the left and right mix and the one microphone in this case, have correctly been synced. So yeah, I don't know what's up with the media page, but it is in fact syncing properly. And that's the way it works. So that was my biggest tip, is just organize everything by day so you're only ever making Resolve work for one day at a time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right. Next question is Kristen Oyang there. Kristen Oyang is not there. So I am actually going to save those questions for later because they're a little specific. And I'm going to move on to Magda Baez. Magda Baez. Is Magda Baez out there? Magda Baez is not out there, but this is a good question. And it's something people have to deal with all the time, and that is, what are options to solve footage that has some areas overexposed, such as interior shots with windows? And I think, looking at the time, this is going to be my last question answered today. I was wanting to go for an hour and a half. This is going to take me a little bit over, but it's a good question. So I'm going to go back to my other project. And if I go into color, I have a variety of overexposed shots. So how you deal with this really kind of depends on what the media is giving you. And it depends on what your deliverable is. And I'll kind of talk a wee bit about HDR in this instance as well. So for this clip, this first clip, this is from a movie shot on an early DV camera, or not DV camera, I should say, an early HD camera. If I play around with the gain on this to bring it down, you can see if I switch to either the parade or the waveform, there's no detail in those highlights. Those highlights were blown out during the shoot. There's a little bit of stuff in the so-called super white part of the signal, and you can see it back there. There's just a whiff of image detail. But by and large, it's gone. And I don't know how many times I've had conversations with clients where they say, oh, you know, can't you just bring those highlights down? And I'm like, yeah, I can. The problem is when I do that, it's just sort of a dull, flat area now rather than any more detail coming into it. And in these cases, generally speaking, I prefer to leave the highlights back up near the top. If it's going to be blown out, I at least want it to be bright enough to justify being blown out. Now, in some instances, there may be a little more detail lurking in the super white part of the signal, especially if you're dealing with video that was shot years ago, stock footage or archival material may have a little more detail out there in the super white, but you know, it's not going to be what you get when you're dealing with RAW, for instance. Now, this is not the original RAW clip. This is a clip that was down converted for offline editing. But I tend to down convert my media for editing as log encoded. So if I turn this off, you can see here's the log encoded ProRes proxy clip that I gave to my editor. And the way that I've worked on my last two movies is I go ahead and create, because of course the director creates the editorial media, right? Isn't that how things work? I went ahead and created a set of offline editorial media to send to the editors That is log encoded, and I set up a project for them to work with that had color management enabled so that all of this was made normal. Basically, they would get this. Now, for the edit, seeing something like this isn't the worst thing in the world, especially since if you go later on in the clip, you go inside and you see all the detail you want. But in the initial grade, if you just normalize this, this is what I end up with. I end up with a 709 image that's completely blown out here, even though if I go into my gain and I bring it down, there's all that detail that I can bring in. So the question is, how can I have my cake and eat it too with this kind of wide latitude footage when I'm grading in a lower latitude delivery format like Rec 709? Now, of course, the HDR grade for this was fantastic because I was able to push this a lot harder and still have this lovely detail showing through. But when I'm doing the SDR grade, you know, that's when it gets a little thorny. There's basically 3 approaches you can try. They work with varying degrees of success. And I'll start with the first 2 if you're just trying to be manual about how you're dealing with this. You want to handcraft how the highlights are dealt with. So the first thing I always recommend doing is make sure that your primary grade is the way you want it to be. Say this is the sum total of this shot. We just want to get her emerging into this space and then cut. I want to make sure that I get a little bit of exposure in here. So I'm just kind of playing around to see how can I get all of these shadows to look reasonably pleasing. And generally speaking, I start with lift gamma gain, and then I move to custom curves to try and see if there's anything else I can shape in those shadows. In this case, I kind of want to compress the midtones a bit, but make sure that I'm not letting the darker shadows hit the floor. I like having a little bit of that diffuse glow in there. So step 1 is just make sure you grade the image as well as you can. And then I'm going to try and deal with these blown out highlights. One thing you can try and do, depending on how much movement there is in the shot, is you can try to window these areas. That's usually, if you're doing a manual grade, the most successful thing you can do. So I'm going to do a terrible job just to make the point. So I might do that, and then I'll go ahead and add another one. And again, I'm specifically doing a terrible job because I just want to make the point as quickly as I can. Yeah. All right. So I window this, and then I can start experimenting with how can I bring these levels down and kind of feather it into the rest of the image. And this is where Resolve's outer shape really comes in handy when you need to split the difference. So that's one thing you can do, but now I've got to track all this and I have to animate it and blah, blah, blah. But it's very successful and I can get a really nice amount of detail in here. And then of course I'll want to nudge this grade and make it more appropriate. But again, I think you can see what I'm getting at. So that's one way of dealing with this. But now, of course, when this camera pans to the right, I'm going to have to probably do a combination of tracking and roto to make sure all this works right. And that's going to be a time-intensive thing. So that means I might also try something that's maybe going to be successful 25% of the time. So it's kind of a do we get lucky maneuver. And that is I will try pulling a Luma key to see if I can key these blown out areas and then bring them in through the key. So let's see how that goes. And I'm just going to do this manually. Actually, did you know you can drag these? Bet you didn't. That was a new feature that got added somewhat recently. And actually, if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows and drag, I can add softness. So I'm just going to call it quits there and then see if this is useful or if it looks terrible. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And once again, if I bring that down, it's actually not terrible. This in conjunction with probably a little window work down here would do me if this was what I was trying to do. And now I don't care about doing all that animating. So in this case, I would say I got lucky with the caveat that I'm going to need to use a window to clean that up. So this is another way that you can deal with basically artificially creating a kind of photographic HDR bit of business. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a different approach for this. And depending on what kind of program you're working on, if you have to turn around a 30-minute or a 60-minute episode of television a day because you're doing some reality grading, this may actually be the way that you really do this. And that is to go into Open Effects. And I'm going to go into my I think I want gamut mapping. And I'm gonna, no, that's not the one I want. The one I want is, you know what, I think I'm just gonna use color space transform. So, actually, you know what? I can just do it right in here. So there's a tone mapping feature in the color space transform node that I'm using to normalize this image from red wide gamut RGB and red log 3G10 to Rec 709. And this tone mapping, if I just set it to simple, you can see automatically tries to move those highlights into the image and feather the transition between those compressed highlights with a little bit of image detail and the rest of the image. There's also a gamut mapping option in case you need to do some saturation mapping as well. In this case, we don't. There's also a custom luminance mapping option that lets me adjust the input nits and the output nits that I want to be using here. And so this is a way to really quickly give yourself a starting point. Now, tone mapping isn't going to give you a finely graded image that's going to look good. What it's going to do is it's going to give you an image that has rich detail in compressed highlights, so you don't have to jump through giant hoops trying to bring all that detail back in. At that point, it's going to be incumbent upon you to go ahead and grade it. And usually I find in these instances, I have to do a little bit of curve work to kind of give the image the the density that I want it to have. So there's going to be some nudging, but as you can see, if you're working in a hurry, this gives you a perfectly wonderful result. The other techniques gave you more control because you were truly manually adjusting. You were being the tone mapping algorithm. But this works too. And it's a heck of a lot faster. And as much as this shot moves, you know, it's done. So that's my pitch with solving overexposure. The last thing I'll say is you will find yourself in situations like with this shot where you've got a blown out window. In this case, they're really, I am using the raw. Well, no, I'm not. This is also a down converted clip. But you can see if I drop this down, there's plenty of additional image detail out there to be had. But there's so much movement that you're either going to be using tone mapping as the simple solution. Again, I can go in here, set it to simple. This is a darker image, but now I can go ahead and grade it manually to try and find some good middle ground. Or if I don't like the result of that, then I'm going to do what I did in this project, which is roto her. Just give her a loose roto so that I could cut her out of this, and then a combination of shapes and keys to isolate those windows so that I could manually bring in the detail that I wanted to do. And sometimes that's just going to be the way it is. You're just going to be set up for doing a lot of work on those shots to get the result that you want. If we had more money, obviously the wonderful thing to have done would be to have done what I did. You were probably wondering about the window behind me and how good a webcam I have. ND filter. If we had more money, we would have ND'd those windows, and that would have given me the control that I wanted without all this extra stuff. So don't ever underestimate an onset solution. And that's kind of a great place for me to leave off for this inaugural episode of Happy Hour with Alexis Van Hurkman. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Go ahead, and if you've got questions that you'd like me to answer next week, go ahead and hit my webpage. I'm going to put up another page to collect questions. Or if you just want to hear what the next random batch of questions is, show up next week, same bat time, same bat channel. And this has been fun. I think I'll keep doing it. Thanks a lot.